3 identical envelopes waited on 3 separate doorsteps across the city, carrying an unmistakable signature: the meticulous handwriting of Mildred Story, the wealthy, estranged matriarch of an isolated island estate. The letters summoned Millie Story, Jonah Story, and Aubrey Story back to their ancestral home for a mandatory family reunion, promising long overdue financial resolutions. They packed their bags, driven by individual desperation and lingering resentments, navigating the dark, winding coastal roads toward the private ferry dock. But as the island's jagged silhouette loomed under the cold moonlight, a profound realization set in. Mildred Story had passed away 3 weeks prior to the dispatch of those letters. Welcome to Swasti Diaries. Someone else had meticulously forged the invitations, orchestrating an elaborate trap designed to lure the estranged cousins to the isolated mansion. As the cold midnight wind swept across the desolate estate grounds, the investigation into a decades-old family secret officially began. Who orchestrated the summons, and what dark truths were buried within the island's stone walls? Before Mildred Story accumulated her vast estate and retreated behind the iron gates of Gull Island, she always kept a small, tarnished silver thimble on her sewing desk, a quiet memento from her early days as a seamstress that she touched whenever a family crisis loomed. That precise habit vanished the year her youngest sibling disappeared into the unforgiving coastal tide. Decades later, that same unresolved absence hung heavily in the salt-laden air as Millie, Jonah, and Aubrey stepped off the private ferry onto the fog-drenched shores of the island. They did not arrive as a united front, but rather as 3 solitary figures bound by shared desperation and deep-rooted distrust. The island mansion stood before them, its tall Gothic windows dark and unwelcoming against the midnight sky. Mildred had cut them all off years before with a chilling final note sent to each household: "You know what you did." Now, standing in the damp courtyard, the cousins faced a far more unsettling reality. The matriarch was already 3 weeks in her grave, yet someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to summon them here under false pretenses. Why orchestrate an elaborate reunion if the host was already dead? As the heavy oak doors groaned open under the pressure of the coastal gale, the investigation shifted from a simple family gathering to a dangerous unraveling of past sins. The first clue rested just inside the foyer: a discarded ledger, open to a page dated 20 years prior, marked with a heavy red cross. The heavy oak doors of the island mansion closed behind the 3 cousins with a dull, echoing thud, sealing them inside a hallway that smelled faintly of old parchment and damp sea salt. Millie Story dropped her canvas travel bag onto the floorboards, the canvas rasping against the wood with a dry, abrasive sound. Jonah Story ignored his cousin, his eyes locked on the mahogany reception desk situated dead center in the foyer. Resting directly on its polished surface sat a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed tightly with red wax bearing an unbroken family crest. No wind blew through the closed hallway, yet the corner of the envelope fluttered faintly as if reacting to a sudden drop in barometric pressure. Aubrey Story stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the slate tiles before she caught herself and halted. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, precise, elegant, and unmistakably penned by Mildred Story herself, despite the matriarch having been buried 3 weeks prior. Inside that sealed enclosure lay a single typewritten directive referencing the tragic winter of 20 years ago, a time when the youngest family member vanished beneath the icy coastal waters without a trace. The cousins stood in absolute silence, staring at the wax seal. None of them dared to touch it first. Every single one of them harbored a secret reason for returning to this isolated rock, yet the presence of this fresh, precisely addressed letter meant someone else was already inside the mansion, watching their every move from the shadows. The sealed envelope remained untouched on the mahogany desk, but the heavy oak doors had barely settled into their iron frames before Millie, Jonah, and Aubrey gravitated toward the estate office down the hall. They did not speak of the forged invitation or the dead matriarch. Instead, their collective survival instinct pulled them toward the records that could explain their sudden, desperate summons. Inside the private study, a heavy brass desk lamp cast a pale golden pool of light across a row of leather-bound ledgers. Jonah pulled open the bottom drawer, finding it unlocked. A careless omission that felt deliberate, almost like an invitation left by someone who wanted these financial histories uncovered. The pages inside revealed a shocking trail of institutional payments dating back precisely 20 years. Massive cash disbursements, routed through offshore accounts under Mildred Story's signature, documented a staggering hush money payout designed to bury the truth of a tragic accident on the coast. The ledger exposed a dark reality. Mildred's legendary coldness toward her grandchildren was not born of mere malice, but of a desperate, protective silence meant to shield the family from a manslaughter investigation. Yet, as Aubrey traced her finger over the faded ink of a ledger entry marked with a red cross, a chilling realization took hold. If these records were meant to stay hidden in the estate safe, why had someone deliberately placed them out in the open? Someone inside these walls was not merely reminding them of past sins. They were systematically laying out the evidence for an execution of justice. The financial ledgers told one story of protective isolation, but the leather-bound guest registry on the administrative table told an entirely different, more alarming one. Aubrey traced the ink stains of the final page, noting an entry dated a mere 24 hours before their arrival on the island. A signature occupied that line, written in a looping, unfamiliar hand that did not belong to Mildred Story, nor to any of the estate staff who had retired years prior. Someone else had inhabited the mansion just before the cousins docked, leaving behind fresh physical traces of an uninvited presence that defied the sealed perimeter of the estate. This was no abandoned sanctuary managed by ghosts of the past. The guest log exposed a living, breathing orchestrator who had walked these exact wooden floorboards, inspected the rooms, and meticulously orchestrated every detail of the trap. As Jonah examined the ink bleed under the amber desk lamp, a chilling deduction settled over the room. The handwriting matched a specific archival card from 20 years prior, belonging to a household employee who had vanished the exact night the youngest Story sibling disappeared into the tide. The investigation pivoted instantly. The summons was not sent by a ghost, nor by a grieving matriarch, but by someone seeking a very specific brand of retroactive justice. The discovery of the guest log shifted the entire weight of the investigation from a supernatural haunting to a calculated human retaliation. Two distinct names dominated the estate records of the past decade, both intimately tied to the daily operations of the island and both harboring dark, unexpressed grievances against the Story family. First was Arthur Pendleton, the long-serving estate manager whose loyalty to Mildred Story masked a simmering bitterness over the hush money payouts he was forced to administer 20 years ago. Arthur knew every financial irregularity, every compromised bank transfer, and every hidden secret that protected the family from criminal prosecution. Yet, alongside Arthur stood Elena Vance, the former head housekeeper who abruptly vanished the exact night the youngest sibling disappeared into the tide, only to surface briefly in the guest registry 24 hours before the cousins arrived. Both individuals possessed unrestricted access to the estate keys, both understood the intricate layout of the cliffside mansion, and both had powerful, lingering motives to drag the cousins back to the scene of the original tragedy. As the cold midnight air swept through the hallways, the question was no longer who had sent the forged invitations, but which of these two shadowed figures had finally decided to collect a debt that was 20 years in the making. The investigation required a closer look at the personal quarters of the estate staff, where physical proof of the trap waited to be uncovered. The fragile truce among the three cousins fractured the moment the guest log details sank in. Millie Story paced the length of the hallway, her footsteps echoing sharply against the hardwood, while Jonah Story stood rigidly near the base of the staircase, his arms tightly crossed over his chest. They had lied to each other about why they came back to this forsaken rock. Millie needed the inheritance to settle massive debts that were closing in on her life, but Jonah had visited the estate grounds a week prior without telling anyone. Aubrey Story knew this, keeping silent about a missing sibling from 20 years ago, while watching her family tear itself apart from the inside out. The tension in the damp room was absolute, devoid of melodramatic shivers, replaced instead by the cold, hard logic of mutual suspicion. If Arthur Pendleton had managed the hush money payouts 20 years ago, and Elena Vance had signed the guest book 24 hours before their arrival, then the trap was not set by a random stranger. It was a calculated, internal retribution engineered by someone who knew every single dark secret the Story family had tried to bury beneath the coastal tides. Aubrey broke the silence, confronting Jonah about his prior unauthorized visit to the estate grounds. The answers did not offer comfort. They only narrowed the list of suspects to the very people standing in the hallway. The physical ledgers and signed guest registries had painted a damning picture of premeditated revenge, yet a critical piece of physical evidence was about to flip the entire narrative on its head. Deep within the mahogany-lined library, behind a loose section of wainscoting that concealed an old wall safe, lay an artifact that had escaped the notice of everyone except the estate's true architect. It was not a forged letter or a financial payout receipt. It was a vintage microcassette tape, resting inside a velvet-lined compartment, bearing a handwritten label dated only 3 weeks prior. When Jonah slid the tape into a portable transcription unit found on the reading table, Mildred Story's actual voice crackled through the small built-in speaker. Smooth, cutting, and entirely devoid of senility or confusion. The matriarch was not murdered by a vengeful former employee, nor was she oblivious to the financial vultures circling her estate. Her recorded words dismantled the primary assumption of the entire investigation. She revealed that she did not disinherit her children out of arbitrary malice, but rather because her private audio logs had finally captured the exact moment one of her grandchildren engineered the tragedy of 20 years ago. The financial ledgers were not hush money paid to cover up an accidental drowning. They were ransom payments extorted by an insider who held the proof of deliberate manslaughter. The cousins stared at the spinning magnetic tape as the mechanical hum filled the silent room. If Mildred knew the truth all along, why did she leave the evidence locked away instead of going to the authorities? The answer rested in the final sentence of her recording, a warning that the person who orchestrated their return tonight was not seeking justice, but completing an unfinished execution. The audio recording left no room for comforting illusions. Mildred Story had spent her final months not in declining cognitive fog, but in sharp, calculated awareness of a decades-old crime that the family thought they had successfully buried beneath coastal silt and hush money. The cassette tape revealed that one of the 3 grandchildren standing in the mansion tonight was directly responsible for the manslaughter 20 years ago, and Mildred had quietly documented every single transaction, every frantic phone call, and every threat. She did not take the evidence to the police because the family name was her final shield, choosing instead to let the weight of guilt slowly fracture them from within. But the true horror of the discovery lay in the realization of who actually pulled the strings to bring them back. It was not Mildred seeking posthumous retribution from the grave. It was Arthur Pendleton, the long-serving estate manager who had administered the hush money payouts and watched his own life warp around the family's dark secrets. Arthur had listened to the matriarch's recordings, seized control of the estate operations, and forged the invitations to lure Millie, Jonah, and Aubrey back to the exact room where the original tragedy occurred. The tension in the library shifted instantly from mutual suspicion among the cousins to a terrifying race against an unseen adversary, who possessed both the motive and the keys to trap them inside. As the mechanical hum of the cassette player finally ceased, a sudden metallic click echoed from the heavy iron security door at the end of the dark corridor, confirming that their exit was now completely sealed. For a brief, deceptive moment, the scattered puzzle pieces seemed to lock into an airtight conclusion. The financial ledgers, the coded margin notes, and the commanding presence of Arthur Pendleton pointed to a singular, calculated orchestrator who had managed the estate records for decades and engineered the entire revenge plot to avenge the long-forgotten tragedy. Every circumstantial thread converged neatly upon the estate manager, suggesting he had meticulously staged the invitations to exact a final, devastating reckoning for the events of 20 years ago. It was a neat, satisfying hypothesis that neatly tied together the missing funds, the forged envelopes, and the bitter resentments festering behind the island's stone walls. But forensic evidence rarely bows to convenient theories. A sharp discrepancy in the estate's private boat logs completely dismantled the assumption before the clock struck 2. The dock register recorded an outbound vessel departing the island during the exact hour Arthur was supposedly tampering with the library safe, a vessel operated by an entirely different hand. The case against the estate manager dissolved instantly, replaced by a far more chilling realization. Someone else was moving through the dark corridors, someone whose alibi had never been questioned because they had spent the entire evening playing the role of a terrified, innocent victim trapped alongside the others. The true architect of the island trap was still hidden in plain sight. The physical puzzle pieces shifted dramatically under the pale amber glow of the desk lamp, as the forensic analysis of the invitation letters yielded an undeniable chemical truth. Under microscopic examination, the paper fibers of the decoy envelopes revealed faint, microscopic deposits of crystallized sodium chloride, saltwater spray unique to the exposed lower rocks of the island's eastern cliffside. More telling was the ink itself, a rare, iron gall compound used exclusively in the administrative ledger pens locked inside the estate office. It was a physical signature that pointed away from external intruders and cast suspicion straight back onto the permanent staff. The mastermind had never left the building. Arthur Pendleton had not engineered the plot alone. Rather, someone with daily access to the office supplies had meticulously copied the matriarch's handwriting down to the finest flourish. But the realization carried an even darker implication. If the letters were fabricated on-site by someone living under the same roof, the security breach was absolute. The cousins reviewed the ledger entries again, noting how the ink density changed precisely 24 hours before their arrival. The investigation narrowed down from a wide circle of suspicion to a single resident who understood every shadow, every locked door, and every buried secret of the estate. The person who forged the summons was still walking the corridors, waiting for the final piece of the trap to close. Reconstructing the timeline of that fateful night required stripping away the panic and laying out the physical movements piece by piece. The forged invitation letters were not dispatched from a mainland mailbox, nor were they dropped off by an external courier. They had been prepared right here, within the damp administrative quarters of the estate, using paper stock from the lower desk drawer and ink drawn directly from the old quill set. The sequence of actions became painfully clear when matching the movement of the boat logs against the timestamp on the cassette recording. Someone inside the household had watched the family fracture over the past 20 years, quietly collecting evidence, noting financial ledgers, and waiting for the precise moment when greed and desperation would override caution. The trap on Gull Island was never designed for random visitors. It was an intricately engineered arena meant to force a public reckoning among the three cousins. As the cold coastal draft rattled the window panes, the investigation zeroed in on the physical mechanics of how the decoy letters made their way across the water. Every detail pointed toward an internal hand that possessed both the intimate knowledge of the family crimes and the patience to orchestrate a silent, delayed vengeance. Yet, one critical question remained entirely unresolved. How did the orchestrator bypass the estate security system without tripping the silent alarms installed by Mildred Story herself? Before the final confrontation could take place in the estate's grand parlor, the overhead chandelier flickered twice and abruptly died, plunging the cavernous room into absolute darkness. Only the faint, pale spill of coastal moonlight through the tall French windows cut across the hardwood floorboards, casting long, distorted shadows against the dark wood paneling. Millie froze near the fireplace, her breath catching in her throat as the mechanical hum of the backup generator failed to engage. In that sudden heavy silence, a sharp creak echoed from the balcony overhead, a distinct footstep pressing down on a loose board that only someone intimately familiar with the mansion's structural decay would know to avoid. The investigation had narrowed its focus to a singular, agonizing possibility. The broken alibi belonging to one of the cousins was no longer just a discrepancy. It was the structural pivot upon which the entire 20-year conspiracy balanced. As the cold night air rushed through an unlatched side door, carrying the sharp scent of damp sea salt, the remaining doubt evaporated. Someone in this room had engineered every decoy, manipulated every ledger, and orchestrated this gathering not to uncover past sins, but to ensure they went unpunished forever. The final piece of the puzzle was sliding into place, and the person holding the key was standing right in the dark corridor, waiting for the trap to finish closing. Aubrey's story stood alone in the dim archives, her breath forming faint vapor in the unheated air, as she faced the undeniable truth of that fateful night 20 years ago. The orchestrator of the entire island summons was none other than Aubrey Story herself, who had meticulously engineered the elaborate trap to expose the family's decades-long hypocrisy. She had concealed her reasons for returning because the inheritance was merely a secondary motive to force a public reckoning for the manslaughter of the youngest Story sibling. Mildred Story had discovered the truth years prior, capturing Aubrey's frantic confession on the cassette tape, but chose to conceal the extortion demands and the recording in the wall safe to protect the family name from total ruin. Meanwhile, Arthur Pendleton had merely administered the hush money payouts 20 years ago under direct orders from the Matriarch, unaware that Elena Vance had witnessed the tragic accident from the cliffside edge. Elena Vance signed the guest log 24 hours before the cousins arrived, not as an intruder, but as Aubrey's covert accomplice, helping to smuggle the decoy invitation letters onto the island to ensure the conspiracy came to light. Aubrey forged the letters using the estate administrative ink and saltwater-stained paper, orchestrating every single detail to dismantle the lies that had sustained the family fortune. As the final piece of evidence clicked into place on the mahogany desk, the cycle of silence was irrevocably shattered, leaving the remaining cousins to confront a legacy built entirely on blood and deception. The flashing red and blue lights of the Marine Police cutter cut through the pre-dawn mist, casting fractured crimson reflections across the wet wooden planks of the private dock. The island's silence returned, heavy and absolute, stripped of the deceit that had sustained the Story family fortune for 2 decades. Millie, Jonah, and Aubrey stood apart on the frost-covered shore, their individual secrets exposed to the cold morning air as the authorities secured the estate grounds. The cassette tape rested inside an evidence box on the stern of the police boat, its magnetic ribbon bearing the final irrevocable proof of a tragedy buried too deep for time to wash away. Mildred Story had left behind more than a silent estate. She had left an unyielding mechanism of truth that finally dismantled a legacy built on blood and hush money. As the cutter engine roared to life and turned its bow toward the mainland, the generational curse of Gull Island was permanently put to rest. Thank you for listening to this true crime deep dive on Swasti Diaries.